does culture influence our view of God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, well, I mean, the simplest way to say it is that you can't say a sentence about God or the gospel without engaging in culture. And you
Mm,
can't even think it, right? I mean, so it's like the simplest, maybe theological claim you can make: Jesus Christ is Lord, right? Um, that is sort of the fundamental Christian claim, right?
mhm.
And it's true that Christians across all time, across all cultures, affirm that truth. It's constitutive of the Christian identity. And yet, every bit of that has some cultural freight and differences, right? So when you say Lord, for example, what do we mean by that? Right? That's actually not a word we use a lot, let's say in American vernacular. If you translate the word Lord into other languages, it's going to have different shades of, in terms of what does it mean, in terms of authority, deity, etc. Or take another phrase like Jesus is my healer. I think, again, all Christians would affirm that in some sense. And yet, across different cultural sort of places, that's going to have very different dynamics. Is Jesus a healer more like an American modern doctor? Or is he, or like a therapist? Or like a kind of shaman, but Jesus instead? And so all of the sort of tools we have to work with are bound by our culture. As when I say that, that always sounds to people like a threat, like it's like bad news, like you're all stuck in your cultural prison. And that isn't the case, right? We can translate, we can communicate across cultures. And actually, the reason we can do that is that God does it first. When he decides to speak all the way back to Abram, let's say, or Moses, or any of the prophets, um, he decides to use a local language, a local tongue, and that's not a perfect vehicle. He doesn't sort of find the best language in the ancient Near East, right? He just picks one, and out of his goodwill, that's what it is. And for all the sort of foibles of the Hebrew language, he still can reveal himself fully and clearly there. And of course, we see this most clearly in the incarnation. But
Mm,
in the incarnation, God takes on human identity in a very like local way, right? You think
mhm.
about Jesus had a local accent, local family, um, and that's he's willing to take that risk so that he can communicate and commune with us, and we have to be willing to take that risk as we do theology as well, even though it might feel a little bit scary or it might contain risks. We have to go along with that process. That's the process God has designed for us.
Well, let's get practical then. As you mentioned that, I'm thinking about
Yeah.
you as a kid. You're growing up in the Philippines and you're
Mhm.
growing up in a community where there's a lot of Muslims. And we know that, I mean, there are those who are Muslim all around us. God is doing a movement within Islam that we're very
Mhm.
grateful for. But as we're talking about contextualization, let's say that
Yeah.
you meet a Muslim. It might be a coworker, it might be a fellow student that you meet in university. It could be any of these different things. It could be the
Yeah.
neighbor across the street that just moves in.
Yeah.
You're talking about God, their conception of God. They use the word, of course, we've had this discussion, we've seen it all within the media,
Yeah.
Allah. Do we
Hmm.
use that word? Or,
Mm.
I mean, these are some of the questions that contextualization is wrestling with, right? Is this a good
Yeah.
example?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a fine example, and yeah, it's the kind of thing that a missionary faces all the time, like constantly. Especially, I would say, in first generation missions movements, you have to sort that out. And there's incredible debate about how to do that well. The God name question is one of the classic ones. So, like in China, for example, there is a long running debate about which Chinese word to use for God. Among Christians today, even there's different translations of the Bible that use different words, and you know the one thing it makes you realize is there was never a perfect word for God in English either. Uh, we landed on one, and then we explained as much as we could why this word doesn't mean what you might have thought it meant, but it actually is, the God revealed in Scripture. And in a way, we're all doing that. Every pastor is doing that wherever they are, is trying to help their people sort of understand, yes, God is powerful, but not powerful in the way that you have a distorted view of power in your local culture, for
Mm.
example. So yeah, I mean, that's a good example. It sort of could multiply, 1,000, a million
Oh yeah.
times. And what's interesting, I guess, is just to say that number one, when you work in multiple cultures, you start to just see that more. And number two, when you have Christians from multiple cultures, they have different blind spots and recognize different aspects, let's say, of God's transcendence, identity, attributes, because of sort of the tools or the hooks that they have in their cultural context.